Hello and welcome to another edition of Empathy at the Table. I'm your host, Tony Anagor, and I'm a leadership coach and a negotiation skills trainer. I specialize in emotionally intelligent negotiation, which is taking a look at negotiation, the strategies, the approaches, and looking at them through the lens of emotional intelligence. We help companies reshift the way they negotiate internally, aligning teams, dealing with competing priorities. We work with helping them build long-term lasting partnerships and relationships, and also to deal with conflict, which sits at the heart of innovation in companies today. Today, I'm really pleased to introduce our guest. His name is Kirk Kinnell. Kirk worked for 30 years in the police force in Glasgow. He was the head of the organised crime unit and the counterterrorism unit. So he has plenty of experience dealing in high-pressure negotiation situations. And he brings that experience to the corporate world today. I often get asked, are the skills from a hostage negotiator, are they applicable in the corporate world? Well, we'll find out today. Look forward to seeing you on the other side with Empathy at the Table. Hello and welcome to another edition of Empathy at the Table. Buckle up, hold on to your seats. We're in for a real ride today. I'm really pleased to introduce Kirk Kinnell to Empathy at the Table. Hi, Kirk.
Good morning, Tony. Thank you very much for a warm introduction to your show.
Thank you, Kirk. So before we kick off, just for our listeners, would you just explain a little bit about who you are and your interest in negotiation?
Absolutely. So my 30 years in law enforcement meant that I started off as a young armed response officer and as a hostage negotiator. And I continued that through my 30-year career and eventually retired as the head of armed policing and hostage negotiation in Scotland. I also worked on the international group and the global group of negotiation, so it was natural that when I retired from law enforcement, I would keep doing the thing that I loved, which was negotiation. So I set up my company, and I've been negotiating in the corporate world, in the humanitarian sector, and of course, every type of area where you can imagine negotiation would be relevant. I just find myself going that journey. So yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. So when I told my kids this morning, I said, right, yeah, I've got a podcast interview with a negotiation expert. And they kind of sometimes think that negotiation is boring. And I said, well, you wait till you hear what this guy has to say. This guy is anything but boring. So when we hear about negotiation, when we see in the movies and the Netflix series, they talk about all the sensational stuff behind negotiation. That's kind of the world you lived in. I know you worked, in the streets of Glasgow where it was, real tough. I'm from the UK, from London, and in London we grew up knowing that Glasgow was where they made, the tough people. So the question is it really as glamorous and as heroic as it's made out to be in the Netflix movies?
No, absolutely nothing like it. Absolutely. I think. So for me, as a young negotiator, I was going to the bridge to help someone who was contemplating suicide at 1, 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, in the cold and the wet and the rain and the wind, and nothing glamorous about that. And you're there for 4, 5, 6 hours and you're soaking through, and that's where you cut your teeth. Of course, you start to develop into siege operations, and the further up the ladder you get in the negotiation portfolio, you start to deal with kidnap for ransom, extortion, international kidnap, and of course, as I've continued to explore that journey in the humanitarian world, in the corporate world, where there's all manner of different challenges, but you'll probably like this thing, Tony, that I say, all of the skills that I've learned in the world of hostage negotiation, and it's high pressure, high stakes negotiation, and life is at stake. on all of them when you're going through that journey. But it's the same skill set, and it's the same skill set that you use, different context, to put your kids to bed at night. It's the same stuff, right? So your kids will probably recognise that maybe you're using good negotiation skills on them when you're trying to get them to do what you need them to do, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I started teaching my kids at a very early age. I have 14-year-old triplets now, and
Wow.
I kind of wish I hadn't. But I remember when they were about 4 years old, we were teaching them how to negotiate with each other. So we would give them things to do, and we would say, okay, go away and talk amongst yourselves. But the only caveat is when you come back, all of you must be satisfied. If one person's not satisfied, then that's not really a negotiation. And so they learnt this skill set. And then I remember a couple of weeks later, I was like, okay, 9 o'clock, time for bed. And they looked at me and said, Daddy, but surely we have to negotiate first. And my wife looked at me and she said, you're causing some problems, yeah? And,
Yeah.
14 years old, that's definitely where we are. I heard a great story that you told, Kirk, which I really love, and I hope you can expand on it. Was when you were a law enforcement officer, the first experience you had with negotiation was a guy who was ready to kind of blow himself up and blow things up. And you saw how you thought your skill set was pretty cool, but you saw how the negotiators were able to talk this guy down and start talking about his music collection and stuff like that. I mean, can you open up and share a bit about that for us?
Yeah, so it probably for me it was a recognizable moment in my law enforcement career where I was at the scene. It was a siege. It was a guy who was in distress. He had turned on the gas in the building. He was threatening to ignite the gas and blow the building up, and it would obviously affect the residents. He was in a 4 in a block, and he had a weapon. He had a gun. And of course, our negotiations at that point in time were, as you can imagine, as a young armed cop, you're delivering your training where you're barking instructions at people, you're dominating the conversation, put down the gun, we're armed police, these kinds of things, these kind of instructions. And they were having little or no effect on him. And shortly thereafter, we were joined by the hostage negotiation team, of which I was not one at that point. And the lead negotiator was at my side. And he's still my friend to this day, John. He definitely inspired me to do that. But he engaged the individual. And within 5-10 minutes of the dialogue, he was having a different tone to the conversation, a different type of negotiation, and he was picking up on things that I hadn't been listening for, I hadn't been looking for. For me, I was looking for threats, the weapon, his behaviour, his body language, but he was listening for words. And of course, he struck a connection with them. And of course, he'd heard some music in the background of the house. I didn't even hear it. I was so focused on my objective, I never even heard the music. And he started to speak about this music collection. And of course, within 5-10 minutes, the guy's talking about that was the music that he shared with his wife when they were younger and life was going good. But actually, the key to that was the link to his memories when times were good, right? And so when within 10 minutes, the guy puts down the gun, he falls to his knees, floods of tears, and of course, he hands himself in, and it's an easy arrest. And at that moment in time, I was like, wow, I'm going to have to learn that, right? I want to do that, because that's a skill that, for me at the time, it just looked like it was magic. But of course, when you start to learn a little bit more about how to connect with people, especially in high pressure, high stakes moments, then you recognizing a little bit about the emotions that at play. Of course, empathy being a significant factor in that. But he connected with an individual, and now we know that as creating an engrossed transformational moment where we reverse engineered how did we get to that point. And then we understand there's a bit of a process. Of course, when we talk about negotiation, it's the science of negotiation using neuroscience and psychology versus the art. And the art is, what do you do with that information? How is it appropriate in this moment with this individual? So for me, it was exploring that process, if you like, but also learning to play with it and bringing your own personality to boot. So yeah, for me, that started my fabulous journey. Yeah, I've often shared that moment with John to tell
I
him
love that. Yeah.
he's responsible for my addiction to this
I
skill
really
set.
like what you said, the last thing you said, which was you've got to make this personal. You've got to make it authentically part of your DNA. Otherwise, you can come across as manipulative, and people can smell that a mile away. So it's important to learn the skills, but then it's important to make sure that they fuse and they blend and they become part of your natural way of speaking, natural way of communicating. Have you come across in your time what happens when things go wrong? When people, negotiators, I know you've talked about ego in a negotiation, when the ego kicks in and negotiators are maybe not as authentic as they should be. Have you come across any of those kind of experiences?
Yeah, listen, I have a couple, and rather than, I wouldn't criticize anyone else in the team who are there for, I'll point this back at me, right? So there most likely was times during that, because for me, ambition and success is not possible without ego, right?
Yeah.
So we all have an ego. And it's about recognizing at what point do we play with your own ego, but balance it with humility, right? So, and I remember on my initial course, one of the phrases the director would say when you were just a young negotiator was, leave your ego at the door. And I remember hearing it, I remember understanding it and thinking, I was like, I'm okay, I'm quite a humble guy, I'm confident, but I'm always self-aware. But there probably was a few times where I was convinced that I was right and I wasn't right, right? There's a couple of times when you can get stuck in your own mindset and you almost become argumentative.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just need a whisper in your ear from a team, because that's what we always are, is to say, are you helping or are you hindering this dialogue, right? And when you hear that phrase, you think, yeah, I'm probably hindering the dialogue. And you just change your mindset. It's like in the team, we constantly check each other. So yeah, I remember being whispered that a few times over the years. So it's something that as a team, we all make sure that we keep ourselves grounded, because actually in all the years that I was as a hostage negotiator, and I say this with a little bit of tongue in cheek, that probably was, at 250, 300 instances where we saved people's lives, right? But I never felt that I won anything in any of those. I never come away thinking that was a victory, that was well done me. It was just like you just became embroiled in the other person's story so much that it was always about them, right? So in the world of negotiation, we have a phrase as, it's not about you, it's about them. So it's always about them. Even when we try to connect with them and we're listening, it's always about their perspective first, right? Their agenda is always first, because, and I know you'll know this, that until someone feels heard and understood, they'll not be open to any other perspective. So why would you try and make your point in an argument than just making them feel heard and understood and making them open to the perspective and new ideas? And very often, the very solution that you would propose at that moment in time, they can see it themselves for the first time. So it's learning that humility. I think that, I hope that's kept me grounded over the years.
I mean, when you say it, right, it sounds so obvious, right? It sounds, of course, if you make sure, that the other person is understood, the other person feels heard, then naturally they're going to reciprocate. Well, you'll show me some respect, so I'll do that back to you. But I find that when you get into, a real negotiation scenario, this kind of monster takes over. And this is something I really battle with when I, teaching emotionally intelligent negotiation, because it's that monster that takes over, that's in the background, that we don't really spend time practicing and dealing with that. We get all of the other stuff really, really well versed. But what do you do when that animal just takes over and you either you're scared, you're anxious, or you actually just want to win and beat the other person? How do you have any tips on how to deal with that kind of rush of emotion?
Yeah, listen, so for me, all of my negotiating team colleagues, we we self-analyze. And when you self-analyze, you look for your emotional red button. What is your trigger? What's the thing that provokes you to react? And of course, when you understand where that comes from, gradual exposure to that can make you immune to that reaction. We call that stress inoculation training, right? We put you under pressure, we look for your buttons and we press them constantly. And eventually you stop reacting, right? Because it gets in the way of your objective. And so I have worked for some, negotiating companies in the past, and their philosophy was about, in a corporate negotiation especially, take the lead. Be the one that asks the questions. Invite them to your room. And for me, it's nonsense, right? Because for me, taking the lead is almost like let them drive. You can just guide the ship or the car. You don't have to be the dominant voice. And in fact, I remember being in a corporate negotiation with a US firm a few years back, and it was back and forward, back and forward, back and forward, and it was a tough negotiation. I was against 4 lawyers and 3 negotiators, and me and one guy from my company. And they said after about 4 months, Kirk, we're confused. What is it you want, right? Because we've not really heard what you want. Why are we even here? And I said, well, actually, the reason I haven't made a proposal yet is because I've been trying to understand you so that when I do make my proposal, I can frame it in a way that's going to land with you, right? Because I have to understand the pressures on you, what will make this good for you. And if I just bash out what I want or demand, we're in an argument, right? It's not a dialogue, it's an interactive monologue. And I want it to be a conversation. I want to build a relationship with you. And until you understand that I'm not here to crush you, it's not a win-lose, right? I'm here to, and it's not even a win-win, right? Because win-wins also don't exist, right? It's about win-win-win. It's about how do I make you can live with this deal, and how do I elevate your status? How do I make you sell this to your bosses and me be able to sell it to my bosses?
Yes,
right.
Yeah.
So for me, it's easy because I don't feel under pressure to be the dominant or leader in that conversation, because I've got the experience and wisdom to know that it's not that relevant. You can still change the speed and direction of a conversation without having to shout and raise your voice, right?
So here's another, just shifting angle a bit. I come across some resistance when I talk about emotionally intelligent negotiation using empathy. People, especially people who are rooted in a specific style of competitive negotiation, which is perfectly valid. I mean, there are different stratas, there are different verticals in the world of negotiation. Most of my stuff is in the corporate world, and it's internal negotiations with companies, aligning their teams and dealing with conflict. And I've noticed that empathy is really becoming a key word, right, in negotiation. But people tend to confuse empathy with being soft, with being a wimp, being namby-pamby. And I look at you and I listen to your background, and you're anything but a weak person. But you've said empathy 2-3 times already. Where do you shake out in terms of bringing the idea of emotional intelligence and empathy to the table when it comes to negotiating?
Okay, great question, right? So thank you for that. So first of all, let's deal with emotional intelligence, right? So, and I think we'll probably sound quite aligned, but we will say something that not the whole world of negotiation agrees with, but I'm okay with that.
Okay.
In terms of emotional intelligence, most of the time when I speak to people about emotional intelligence, they'll talk about, I'm very well aware of my emotions and the things that drive me and the words that I use and blah, blah, blah. And I say, okay, that's important. But the most important part of me for emotional intelligence is what is the impact you have, right? Never mind being aware. You might be aware and still be rude, right? What's the impact you have on other people? So in terms of emotional intelligence, for me, it's about impact on others. Again, we're going back to the perspective of the other side is the most important, right? And in terms of empathy, as a young SWAT team guy, having empathy, and when I cross-contaminated the firearms team and the hostage negotiation team, I heard some of the biggest, toughest armed officers outside the door saying things like, we want this to end, we care about you and the people in there. And that was a different language, right? So they recognise the value in connecting with someone, because actually we're there to save a life. We're not there to escalate the conflict, we're there to de-escalate the conflict. And to recognise that it's more important to be intelligent than to use force or power, right? It's just an intelligent way to do business. But when I talk about empathy, I usually put up the Oxford Dictionary definition of empathy, and it's about recognising and understand other people and sharing their emotions. And I say, for me, the world of negotiation is something different from that. Mm-hmm. For me, I want to build relationships, build partnerships. And so building relationships, building partnerships is about repeat business. And repeat business means profit. Transactional stuff, which is, I'll just negotiate and I'll beat the other guy and it'll be a win-lose and I get the best of this deal. You know, in that moment, you've just created an enemy, and people who build resentment and, you know, determination for revenge. That's not intelligent use of negotiation. So when I talk about empathy, for me, I've got a more precise definition of empathy, because it's not about sharing feelings as well. You know this. If someone says, you know, I can walk in your shoes, Tony, you go, actually, you couldn't walk in my shoes. I've got 14-year-old triplets. You don't know what a day in my life is. And we learned in the world of hostage negotiation, when you were on the bridge and someone says something like, my mother died 2 weeks ago, and you say, I understand how you feel, my mother is also dead. And usually the reaction you get is anger. You couldn't even begin to understand, blah, 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 blah. And you recognise then that what that person feels in that moment when you're trying to connect with them is you're diminishing their experience. So
that's right.
What we try and say is, I couldn't even begin to understand how that must impact on you in a sincere way, right? Because it has to be authentic. But for me, empathy is about recognising and articulating the emotions that they experience and the context of that experience. So it would be something like, it seems to me that you're upset because of A, B, and C. And if you've been listening properly, the person will say, you're right. And even if they say, you know, even if they shout that at you in anger, you're still starting that spiral of agreement, right? They just feel heard and understood. Even if that moment the energy is high or low, we're connecting, right? Different things. Sympathy is when you share the experience of other people. You know, the best examples I have of empathy and sympathy, the difference is sympathetically. My daughter has an infectious laugh, and when she laughs, I find myself laughing the same, right? Or perhaps when someone's crying and you shed a tear. For me, that's sympathy, when you share the same emotion. It's a bit more precise than just there, right? And compassion is when you feel or at least understand what they're going through and you offer them support, right? Okay, so it seems to me that you're really upset because of this. How do we help you get out of this, right? So you're taking it that stage further. So for me, there's three precise definitions of empathy, sympathy, and compassion. And it's important to know that and know when to use that, because to just say things like I understand, or talk about I understand because we look through our prism.
I
always say, no, don't apply your context to their problem, right? Look at their context, connect with them. And of course, if there comes a moment when you can share little bits of experience, do it. But actually, it's not about you. And if you start to dominate the conversation, then you find that the connection takes longer. You're harming rather than helping the relationship, right? It's that, are you helping or are you a hindrance? And when you start, your ego makes you start to talk about you become the hindrance, right? So you learn that, and I've probably done it a million times and had my teammates whisper in my ear, it's not about you, right? Just let's get back onto what they feel.
So you've dealt with psychopaths, narcissists, sociopaths. What about in the hostage world?
Because
that's in the business world, right?
Yeah, that's in the police world. There'll be some difficult profiles in the world of hostage negotiation. Yeah, listen, so, of course, when we were deployed, where there were different personality types, of course, we had psychologists as part of the team. We had clinical psychologists. So it's not my job to diagnose personality profiles. I just look at behavior. And so when you look at the personality profiles of narcissists, sociopath, psychopath, Machiavellian characters, even in a manipulative style, they kind of all display the same behavioral traits. So when you understand those patterns of behavior, then you can get predictable responses to that predictable behavior. And so I don't have to be triggered by someone being arrogant or confrontational or self-obsessed or rude. I just have to understand why they're behaving that way. And when I understand why they're behaving that way, I can usually find a solution to reduce the conflict, understand what they really need, and help them get that. Because as an example, at a siege, if someone's a bank robbery and they're asking for crazy stuff like a helicopter or a getaway car and all of that nonsense, someone trapped in a bank robbery asking for a getaway car, if you're talking about a getaway car, you're talking about the wrong thing, right? Because what they're really expressing is, I wish I wasn't in this situation and I want a way out.
Right.
And that's what they're really saying. So our understanding is to listen to the dialogue and don't just translate that, the words. You have to interpret those words. What are the meaning behind those words? What is the way they say it? What is the tone? What is the situation? What's the context? And if I were in their shoes, what do I think that would be, right? So you can at least have an assumption on what they're really saying. And then, of course, you can test that assumption. So that helps us, even in those situations when you're dealing with different personality profiles. I would always get some psychological support and advice as part of the team. But the reality is, they normally tell us, you're doing fine. We wouldn't do anything different because you're focusing on the behavior and looking for the thing that's driving that behavior. You're not here to analyze people, right? It's not your job. And even a psychologist would probably say, we would, in order for us to analyze and put someone in a box, it would take a long series of interviews, and we're not going to do it in the moment, right? So they would even recommend that we focus on that outward behavior.
So you've skipped over something, so I'm going to bring us back to this because this is really key. It's fundamental to, I think, all negotiations, which is listening. I've heard you mention you call them the Magnificent Seven of active listening. And so can you share those with us? Because I think there's some real great tips in there that people can walk away with.
Yeah, so listen, I say to listen deliberately there, right, for that frolic.
I'm all ears.
When I left law enforcement, in fact, a few years before I left law enforcement, I worked very closely with my good friend in that world, a guy called Richard Mullender, who was a Metropolitan Police negotiator. And we were always analysing, trying to break it down a little bit more. And it started in a conversation I was having with Richard to say, we trained the team today and their performance in the exercise was not good, and I was frustrated. And he said, maybe it's us and not them, right? Maybe we're not teaching it right. We have to simplify it. And I'm like, really? Okay, yeah. So, and that started us thinking about delivering and simplifying what we understand from things like listening. So we come up with the 7 layers of listening that we could at least, what are we listening for? What are the clues that we're listening for? And we come up with 7, and we've been using them for the last 5-10 years. And those 7 layers are, we listen for facts, emotions, values, beliefs, motivators, currency, and worth. And in actual fact, as I constantly, we talk about the pursuit of excellence as constant, we're constantly relearning. I've further defined those Magnificent 7 now. I'll have to come up with a new name because there's 9 layers that I'm listening for. And I'm listening for these 2 things that we spoke about earlier, context and impact, right? So I've got 9 categories of information that I'm listening for in a dialogue, and when I write them down, or I note them, or my team notes them, they help us figure people out. We can see patterns in that. So there's a golden thread woven through all of these layers, which helps us just understand people. And when you analyze that, it's very easy to figure people out. Well, okay, not easy, but you can, at least it helps you improve. And so I train people in listening for those 9 layers. And what we do initially is do this on yourself. Tell your story about you. Just tell your story about you. People will write down things about you. Write things down yourself about you, and you'll figure yourself out. You'll hear things about your emotions, what you become emotional about, what are your values, what's your belief system, what is it that drives you. And that's the key to figuring out your red button. But we tell them, if you can't figure you out, how can you ever expect to figure other people out, right? So that self-awareness, that the thing that you were talking about, emotional intelligence, all of these things are, if you can't be honest with you, how can you ask someone to be honest with themselves in a high stakes, high pressure environment, or when conflict has already happened? When you're speaking about in the corporate world where organizations are maybe working in silos and your people are under pressure, their imagination is telling them threats that might not exist, and so they're not thinking completely logically and rational at that moment. We have to connect with the emotional part of the brain before we can get to logic and ration. So we teach them just shut up and listen.
There are, you mentioned a lot about the negotiation community, right? The practitioners within the community. And I kind of, when I started in the world of negotiation, I realized we're kind of geeks, right? We're in our own world, and we share ideas. But even within there are different kind of factions of negotiators, right? There's the hostage negotiators, and then there's the procurement negotiators and sales negotiators, and then there's conflict resolution and many other verticals in between. I find the best people to hang out with are the people who just have transversal skills, who believe that there are some baseline skills that can be easily kind of switch between the different verticals. But there are some other type of negotiators who would say, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this, what does a hostage negotiator have to do with business? Where's the connection?
Yeah, listen, really good question. So for me, it's about what I thought, the skills that I thought I would bring to the corporate world would be how to do all of those negotiations under the high stakes, high pressure negotiations. Because for me, I recognize that one of the things that makes people fold under pressure was that fear of loss, right? So for me, I would say, I'm going to represent you. Give me an objective. I will exhaust what's on the table because I'm not affected by the fear of loss. I can control that fear in me. I have got many years of being high pressure, high stakes negotiations. I'm resilient to that, and I won't make the situation worse. I'll go to the absolute limit. I'll maximize the objectives in this world, and I will get as much out of this deal as is possibly on the table, right? I won't just accept the first good deal, but I won't crash the deal because I'm greedy, because many times I've gone back to the decision maker to say, we're at the walkaway point, right? You wanted X amount of money. I actually remember being in one particular negotiation where my objective was to get an invoice reduced from 24 million euros to 12. They had clearly just, between two companies, they were relocating properties and all of that kind of stuff. And so I engaged the negotiation team, and I got 24, 12, 20, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, right?
Wow.
Because we were in dialogue exploring the value of this exchange.
Right.
And it took a couple of months. And I go back to the decision maker to say, you set me an objective of 12, but actually we're at 5. Right? I've way exceeded your expectations. We're at 5. And he's like, fabulous. Let's go for 4.5, right? which is predictable.
Yeah.
And so for me, I then bring that fear of loss and say, listen, I've come to you with advice about 5, and I believe we're at the breaking point of negotiations. And my advice to you would be, take the 5. I'll go back in and I'll go for 4.5. But if it breaks down, I want you to know that you'll now share the responsibility with me for this failing, right? Because of greed. And he smiled and laughed and went, take the 5, right?
Yeah.
Because we recognise the power that fear of loss has. And it's my job to not harm the other side. When I'm in negotiation, I don't want to kill them. I don't want to put them out of business. I want that relationship to thrive in a way that we can do business again next year. And so maintaining the relationship for me under pressure is one of the most important things that we also have to find balance. The people who are in the win-lose mindset, well, that's short-term transactional business. And most of the successful businesses that I operate with think about relationships rather than transactions.
I mean, just listening to that, my brain automatically says, I am 100, knowing you already and the way you are, I'm 100% sure that the other part got equal, if not more value than the difference between the 5 and the 24. It wasn't because it's not, I don't hear you celebrating that you beat the other team down to 5. They must have walked away saying, with even greater value, right, in the deal. And that's the idea, that's the objective, is that parties walk away with deals better than they could have got if they were just on their own. Otherwise, why would they come to the table?
Listen, absolutely. And I'll go back to that phrase that I used earlier on. Negotiating for 30 years on the edge of a bridge, I never won a single thing. I never saw it as a win-lose game, right? And so in that particular negotiation I'm describing, of course they felt they got a win with 5 million euros because actually they knew they had double priced a lot of the stuff. And for them, the transition and the repeat business for them was worth 5 times that, right? The value is often hidden, right? So for me, conflict, I love conflict, not that I like fighting or arguments, because for me, conflict is about exploring that journey for where the real value is. And usually in negotiations, people open with their position, but it's not really what they need, right? They ask for what they want, right? And I very often quote the Spice Girls, tell me what you want, what you really, really want, because it's not what you asked for in day one, right? So my job is to figure out what you need, not what you're just asking for. So usually it's either hidden or sometimes people don't know themselves what they really need when they commence a negotiation, and I include me in that story, right?
Yeah, one of my good friends, he's actually a hostage negotiator in Spain. He's by head and shoulders the best I've ever met in Spain. And he says, but he now also does corporate ventures. So he teaches negotiation in the corporate world. And he said, when I'm in the boardroom, I've seen more violence, more lying, more manipulation in a boardroom than I've ever seen in a hostage negotiation. In a hostage negotiation, it's normally pretty clear, right, what they want, and it's just a dance around trying to kind of give each other what we can, what they want, how we can help each other. But in the boardroom, there's lying, there's backstabbing. Would you concur with that?
Yeah, listen, there's a bit of it about, right? But for me, I welcome that, because every time someone tells me a lie, they weaken their position, right? Because they've not thought through the consequences of that lie. You know yourself that the minute you tell a lie, you think you're good at being a good liar, but the other person can see it, smell it, hear it, feel it, taste it, right? You just weaken yourself. So people telling lies to me, of course, I don't call them out initially. We've got a phrase that we have with lies, is that store it, don't ignore it, right? I'll be able to use that lie later on to weaken his power that he's wielding in that moment. Or perhaps they just need to feel strong, or their ego makes them do something. I don't get triggered by that. For me, it's a gift. When someone's lying and manipulating, for me, it usually hides a weakness. And for me, you're like, thank you, you've just told me that you've got a vulnerability and you've pointed me straight at where it is. So I'm going to go there, I'll eventually destabilize you and then make you behave reasonably, right? I'll use your power against you. The manipulative people are usually the first to crumble, because they can weaken their own position, right? Because self-interest is the most important thing to them. So the minute you attach failure to them, they don't want that. So you just get to a point where I don't want to confront them or embarrass them or humiliate them. but I'll make them realise that that continued behaviour is probably not in their interests.
This is, again, I mean, Kirk, you're just coming out with so much beautiful knowledge, and I love this. You know, for me, the tenet of emotional intelligent negotiation and empathy is almost to say, hey, listen, if you want to, you know, play it tough, we can do that. We can go down that route, but it's not going to be of use to you or to me. So there is another way. However, I'm not saying I can't do that. I'm just saying it's not my preferred route. And when, you know, I've done the research on you, and you know, I know you've been in that world. And what gives you that confidence, that ability, is because you know you can handle it. If it gets nasty, if people get manipulative, you've got the skill sets to be able to handle that. And that in itself, when you're in a negotiation, you give off this air of confidence where people typically wouldn't want to try it anyway, because you don't have that sense of desperation about the way in which you kind of communicate.
Yeah, listen, I don't think there's any doubt that when I'm involved in a negotiation, clearly my background reputation thing helps, right? But I don't use that. In fact, if anything, I don't really want that to be there, because their guard will be up, right? I'm just not fazed by it. And I think the key to that is that I have been exposed to it a lot. And I have to, you know, in the world of law enforcement, the one thing that they're really good at is investing in your training. So I was trained often and regular. I made sure my team were refresher training. I'm always reading, always learning, always improving. I was across at the FBI 2006, Philippines 2007-6 with Richard Mullinger. I was the US lead advisor to the US law enforcement and conflict resolution. So I was supported to enhance my skills over and over again. And so the one thing that I would, and I'm not advertising for clients here, right? But I would tell people, invest in your training, right? Because for me, the dividends are incredible, because so much time, energy, and money was invested in making the hostage negotiation world the best they can be, that of course naturally it would rise to the top. And I can justify that by saying, for me, with a 100%, 99.9% success rate over 37 years, well, that was essential. It would not be acceptable for me to go back to my law enforcement bosses and tell them, we had a bad day today again, we had a failure, we had 1, 2, 3 people die this week. That would not be acceptable. So for them it was, you have to be that successful. So we have to invest in you, we have to train to make you as good as you can be, and we want to be the best, and we never stop learning. So for me, you'll never hear me, you know, celebrating how wonderful I am. We never rest on our laurels. We always have to improve. And for me, like this conversation just now, Tony, I'm always looking to other negotiators in the corporate world. They're not a competition for me.
Yeah.
I'm competing with me. And if I engage you or I look at other people, I support them, and I'm trying to learn from everyone else, because that, you know, volume of knowledge is out there. You talk about that negotiating, we're all anoraks, right? So for me, we are a club. We're all evangelical in our beliefs about negotiation, and we should be lifting each other up and helping each other. And for me, you know, if you're a relationship builder, you shouldn't be afraid of that. You shouldn't be destroying relationships with that competitive mindset. So for me, if I come across a negotiation and the other side are in a competitive mindset, I know that for this relationship to succeed, I have to get them out of that in a way where they think about collaboration, and usually self-interest is the key.
Well, Kirk, we've come to the end of this fantastic conversation. I could go on all day long. For our listeners who would, you know, really interested in maybe learning more about you and what it is that you do and how to contact you, can you share what it is that maybe you're really working on at the moment, and how our listeners can make direct contact with you?
Sure, absolutely. So we're working on a couple of things right now. We are working on, you know, in the corporate world, representing businesses in business contracts, in changes of rate. We're negotiating with the unions on for workers. I'm working with different clients in different countries around the world where they're just stuck and they can't afford to lose this deal. And when people can't afford to lose, they contact us to say, it's a really tough negotiation, can we do that? I've also got some of the team at Negotiated Resolutions working on training the universities, both here in the US, and how to deal with protest liaison, because we don't want to escalate that conflict. We want to build relationships. We want to help them recognize that peaceful protest or hearing the perspective of others is not a threat to you, right? So we're always trying to build relationships in every context that we can. But the one thing that people in the corporate world always ask me is, can you make me money? Can you save me money? And can you build my reputation? And we do all of that. So we negotiate with people in tough scenarios where they've hit a bump in the road, and we usually smooth that over and build the relationship so that we can continue to work with each other and everyone makes a profit, because the bottom line is that's why they're there, right?
Fantastic. Can you make me money? Can you save me money? And can you help build my reputation? That's fantastic. Kirk Kinnell, I want to thank you very much for joining us on Empathy at the Table. I'm sure our listeners will get incredible value from our conversation. Thank you once again.
Tony, thank you very much. Really great interview, and enjoyed having a good conversation with you. Most interesting. So,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.